It's definitive outside the Supreme Court. Men are men, women are women, trans women are not women, not just on paper, but in law. It is so seismic, I think, this judgment for women, that you could put it on a par with votes for women.
Today, the judges have said what we always believed to be the case, that women are protected by their biological sex.
What a day of days, Kamal. I mean, I was looking ahead to this Supreme Court judgment, and because of how frankly messed up we have been over recent years about men being men, women being women, confusion over sex and gender, what is gender identity, and all of these wars that frankly have been waged against women, and women like me and other campaigners we're going to speak to in this podcast have been fighting back against for years. I sort of thought, could it be the case that the Supreme Court is going to now make definitions that are going to be so significant for my sex, for my daughters' daughters. And actually what we've had today, what we've heard inside this court, I think has exceeded all of our wildest dreams. It's been so clear what the law states on this issue, and that is that trans women are not women. They've never been women, they should never have been judged to be women, and that actually all of the arguments that women have made to protect female-only spaces, to say that saying you're a woman is not the same as actually being a woman, I think now changes the entire conversation. And it's seminal because it's easy to forget as we celebrate these scenes here. People have lost their jobs over this. Women have been cancelled, men have been cancelled. The debate was closed down. People like me were accused of being TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists. I was called a transphobe. I was called a Nazi. I was called a bigot. And finally, women like me and the women we're going to speak to on today's Daily Tea have been vindicated by the Supreme Court behind us.
I was in courts. It's a rather dry environment in there. You know, it's big benches. You see these old paintings of judges from the ages, you know, back in the 17th and 18th century.
Yeah.
If they had been able to transport themselves to today, looking at a country having a debate about what is a woman and what is a man, they would be absolutely astonished that we'd gotten ourselves into this situation. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the country. You cannot appeal against what it has decided today about biological sex being the key determinant of someone's identity. And it has opened up the next big debate, which is all those public authorities, all those sporting bodies, all those governments, not just the UK government. This was actually a case that came from Scotland, or the Scottish government was proposing that female quotas on boards could include trans women. This was the whole reason for the debate. In 2018, the Scottish government said its quota policy would mean that a public body could reach a female quota of women with trans women. And it was an appeal by a grassroots campaign led in Scotland by Joanna, who was an SNP politician who was absolutely vilified for standing up for women's rights. Her and others building a campaign that has ended up through appeal after appeal after appeal to the highest court in the land. Let's just hear Lord Hodge, who led the appeal court judgment today, what he said very precisely about why sex matters.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex. But we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not.
Really couldn't be clearer there, Kamal. I mean, honestly, this is and I talk about clarity because it's really needed. We had got ourselves into such a mess that people were at 6s and 7s over basic matters of biology, which is what people like me, it's a victory for women, it's a victory for common sense. It's a victory for good education. It's a victory for children's safeguarding. But let's hear from Joanna Cherry, as you say, the former SNP politician, very much on the J.K. Rowling side of the argument, completely vilified for it. Also, I mean, you don't need to point it out, yes, she's a lesbian, she was trying to protect, actually also, lesbians and gays, saying that the transgender movement was actually sort of changing the state of sexuality in the country and saying, girls who want to be lesbians should be allowed to be lesbians without being forced down this kind of trans path that you're being born in the wrong body. No, actually, maybe you just like girls. Maybe boys just like boys. There's nothing to do with wanting to be a different gender. It's just about being homosexual. But let's listen to Joanna Cherry outside the court steps today.
Now it's over to the politicians to make sure that the law is obeyed. So I'm calling on my former colleague John Swinney, the First Minister of Scotland, and on the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to respect this judgment and to do what they say that they do. They both say they believe in women's rights and they believe in women's rights to single-sex spaces. If they mean that, then they need to make sure that public policy changes to respect the fact that woman means biological woman and lesbian means woman who is sexually attracted to another woman. Men are not included within those categories.
What the judgment made clear was that the Scottish Government, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, many other organisations, the Government Equalities Office, which was one of those organisations which put out what's called guidance, pushing people towards the suggestion that gender identity and self-identity should be given consideration when coming to a judgment on the Equality Act. The judgment today said that got public authorities into an incoherent position and that it was important to remember ordinary language, the meaning of sex to the public, what is a man and what is a woman. And it also made the point, which I thought was really important, that this matters because things like how women are treated by the NHS could have been affected by self-identification, pregnancy services, maternity rights. What I did like about the judgment today was its clarity and its brevity. We've talked before, haven't we, Camilla? Sometimes for the public, when there's a big judgment comes out, no one can understand it. No one can understand what they are saying. And I think actually the Supreme Court should be praised for today coming out with a clear judgment. And then very quickly, we were all sitting in court, very quickly they came out and handed out a sort of media pack about what this meant. And it made it very clear.
Also, I don't want history to wash over what the implications of a misinterpretation of the law have meant for women and indeed humans everywhere. We have had the court system embracing the idea that men are women. We've had a complete blind eye taken to the fact that some criminals, some actual paedophiles, have manipulated the system in order to present themselves as women to actually access women and girls. We've had men pretending to be women in order to access women's refuges. We've had a situation where this transgender ideology has overtaken the education system to the extent that we had a situation in some schools where children were self-identifying as a different gender and their parents weren't being told, that they were being pushed down a puberty blocker and indeed, in the case of young girls, mastectomy pathway. History must not wash over that. And equally, I would like to say, as a campaigner for women, that, by the way, this should not now open the floodgates to abuse of transgender people. That is not what this decision is about. I've said this countless times. If a transgender woman wants to say she's a transgender woman, wants to change her name, wants to get a gender recognition certificate, wants me to use her she pronouns, I have always been more than happy to do that. I have total respect for transgender people that want to identify as the opposite sex. My argument from the very beginning is, but that doesn't make you legally or biologically a woman. You will never be legally or biologically a woman, because if we say that, we are reversing actual biological and legal fact. I just want to make that clear, because I don't want this to be about, you can't be trans. That's not what this is about.
There were some trans people here who were making that sort of point, but actually the judgment does also make that very clear. There is, within the Equality Act, gender reassignment is a protected characteristic, And the judge here reminded everyone of that this does not mean that somehow we should now, as you say, open the floodgates to discrimination against trans people. I was speaking to a Welsh campaigner here, and she was saying the depth that the ideology of self-identification in Wales was astonishing, that it was policy in Wales, that many of the parties in Wales had this written into their documentation. So the issue now, Camilla, is how do all these authorities, and how do we hold them to account? They will have to unwind so much of what they have put in place as this slightly odd miasma of everything needs to change, I need to follow the law even though it wasn't the law, has to be cleared. And we need to say, Lucy Fraser, I remember speaking to Lucy Fraser, the culture secretary before the last election, so the Conservative culture secretary. She wrote a piece demanding that sporting bodies changed rules so that there were protected women's categories. And I remember speaking to her, and she said even though she had said it as a government minister, the sporting organisations, not all of them had acted.
Yes.
So our job now, Camilla, is to keep a gimlet eye on where policies are now very, very clearly, and with the stamp of approval of the Supreme Court, against the law.
Yes, and on that note, Kemi Badenoch, who was the Women and Equalities Minister under the last government, has written a piece for The Telegraph that you can access online. Finally, a victory for common sense on trans, but the struggle isn't over. The Conservatives, she vows, will hold Labour's feet to the fire so women don't have to fight for their rights every time. We've got Labour at 6 and 7s over this. We've got the Liberal Democrats, not condemning the judgment, but certainly not supporting it. The Greens again, this is a bad day for trans. Not quite in tune with the judges here. Helen Joyce is somebody who has campaigned on trans issues for many, many years and written really the sort of seminal book on trans called Trans. She joins us now. Can you just summarise what you think this court ruling actually means?
We've just heard the highest court in the land say something remarkable that shouldn't be remarkable, which is that the two sexes, male and female, are a matter of physical reality, of biology, not of paperwork. Until now, all the authorities, the UK government, the Scottish government, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, all the fancy lawyers have said that if a man gets a piece of paper saying he's a woman, that really changes his sex for the purposes of our most important anti-discrimination law. The Supreme Court justices have just accepted that that is wrong. So now, in the Equality Act, which is our most important law about discrimination, when it says man, it really means man. It doesn't mean somebody has got a piece of paper saying man. And when it says woman, it means really woman.
And that's a big victory when you consider the unanimity of the decision making. How would you kind of sum up? I mean, it's a unanimous decision. There's no equivocation about this. There's no ambiguity at last.
It was extraordinarily emotional to listen to it because it was everything that we'd been saying and everything we could have hoped for. We had laid out a scale of what we thought the result might be, everything from a total catastrophic disagreement with us and agreement with the Scottish Government right up to everything we could have hoped for, from 0 to 10. This was 10. So to hear that said, to hear our own arguments repeated back to us from the most important court in the land, like it was an emotional day.
Is it a day then, Helen, when people can pack up their banners, put away their microphones and their campaigns and say, right, we've won that, we can move on to the next issue?
Absolutely not, because the biggest problem has been all along that people have not been obeying the law anyway. So all over the country there are people who think that it's the law that you have to treat people according to the sex that they say they are, and that was never the law, and it wasn't actually what was being heard in this court today. This judgment was really just about the small number of people, about 9,000, who have a piece of paper saying that they have changed sex. Self-ID was never the law, but it's been happening nevertheless. So now we've got this judgment that says that not even a piece of paper can change your sex. We have to go out to people and say, literally there's nothing that can change your sex. Nothing at all, nothing for anti-discrimination law purposes. So all those self-ID policies need to be looked at again. It's strange really because the judgment wasn't about that, and yet it's going to be a trigger for people around the country to go to their employer, to go to their gym, to go to their pub and say, that thing where you say all genders, or if you identify as a woman, you're free to come in here That was never the law, but it really isn't the law now. It's not lawful. Read this 3-page summary of the judgment.
What seized political parties, governments, organisations, sporting bodies, whoever it may be, to decide that despite, as you say, the law never saying that gender could be self-ID'd, or sex, could be self-ID'd, what seized them to go on this wild journey into the nether regions of what identity might actually be?
I mean, there's a famous saying that people go mad in crowds and regain sanity one at a time. This was a madness of crowds. People got this idea into their heads because they thought that it was the next kind thing to do. I think a lot of the time they didn't think that it was really meant. They thought that men who wanted to be women were a very unhappy and depressed group, and that it was kind to treat them as if they were women, and they didn't think through what that meant. You know, if it meant just being nice to them and letting them wear what they want and maybe, you know, calling them what they want and that's one thing. And then too late they realised that what it actually meant was, we can come into a lesbian-only association. We can come into your changing room and get undressed and call you a bigot and try and get you sacked if you complain. You know, we can compete in your sports, even though there's an obvious reason why you have women-only sports. I think people said yes without looking carefully because they thought it was the right and the progressive, the kind thing to do. They were told it was the law. Most people don't pay any attention to the details of the law, and if some organisation like Stonewall tells you it's the law, you think it's the law. And then they thought that women were just being kind of whiny, that we were complaining, that it was just a few, you know. So it's just very sweet to see a court agree that women are real, women exist. Women are not whining when they say that we deserve our own rights.
Also, Helen, speaking as a mother, as we both have on this issue alongside countless others, what does it mean for children and the safeguarding of children?
Well, we're going to have to try to push this ruling out beyond the Equality Act in many ways, because the Equality Act is a very important law, but it's not the only law where sex matters. So we were thinking, you know, it's going to depend very much on how it's framed, what happens next. But the justices were so clear. They said things about pregnancy and maternity. They said things about safeguarding. They said things about lesbians' rights, about sexual orientation. They really went on a whistle-stop tour of lots of places where sex matters. And so now we can use that reasoning, even though the judgment doesn't apply to those other laws, we can use that reasoning in those other laws when it comes to police searching, when it comes to schools' responsibilities to have single-sex spaces, you know, when it comes to data collection. The government is planning a data bill, and it was not being careful about what it meant when it said sex in people's personal data. The reasoning of the judges in this very important case will apply to all those other ones. And of course, it really matters when you're dealing with children that you are clear about the sex of everybody who's there. You can't safeguard children if you're dishonest about anybody's sex. So we're going to have to do that work to push the judgment through into those other areas, but they couldn't have given us a better judgment to do that with.
What Helen Joyce should the Prime Minister do now? This is a man that in recent memory, when asked the question, what is a woman, was unsure of his answer and seemed to suggest that some women could have a penis. We've got a Home Secretary who, when asked a very similar question before the last election, said, when asked what is a woman, said, I'm not going down that rabbit hole. Can you trust, Helen, that this government, this Labour government, will now put in place the guidance and make the effort to make sure that all the policies that you have outlined are changed?
I mean, I've been disappointed over and over again in the last several years, but I'm actually very optimistic about this because I think that the people who spoke like that, you know, Keir Starmer is a lawyer, and lawyers tend to forget about reality and pay too much attention to the pieces of paper. So what Keir was answering was a sort of a lawyer's answer about pieces of paper. He was saying there are about 9,000 people in this country who have pieces of paper saying that they have changed sex, so that he as a lawyer has to accept that they've changed sex, even though they haven't really. Well, now the court has told him that they haven't. It's fine. He can go back to the biological definition. He's not an idiot. He's had kids. He's met a few women in his time, I'm pretty sure. So, you know, it's given him the excuse to say, yeah, that was complex sounding, but now it's not complex sounding anymore. And the other thing is, for Women Scotland, they're a grassroots group of ordinary women who met on Mumsnet, who are holding down other jobs and doing this in their spare time, and they have just had a resounding victory in the Supreme Court. I think that any official, any policymaker, any politician, anyone in an HR department who looks at their policies and thinks, shall I defend this policy or shall I listen to these women who have been saying for years that I got it wrong, who have just won in the Supreme Court? Do you know what? I won't go up against them. I might listen to them this time.
Does Keir Starmer need to come out, though, with a very clear statement now of the government's position, given this Supreme Court judgment?
Oh, totally. I mean, absolutely. The government's position was wrong on this. The Equality and Human Rights Commission was wrong on this, and they're the regulator on this topic. They intervened on the other side. They said that the law was too complex and that it had bad effects, but they said that nonetheless it was the law. The Supreme Court has said, no, it wasn't the law, it was never the law. You, the regulator, got this wrong. It's extraordinary. So now the regulator and the government and civil service, everybody else, all the departments where they have laws that incorporate the meaning of sex in it, they really need to say, we have taken notice of this judgment, we understand what it means, we're looking at its argument, its reasoning, and we will respond swiftly if we've been doing things that were wrong, and most of them have been doing things that were wrong.
Helen, Joyce, thank you so much for joining us on this seismic day.
It really is.
Great to hear from Helen. Of course, she was a great guest on the podcast only a couple of weeks ago. Interesting, isn't it, Camilla? We spoke about Labour there to Helen. Obviously, they're in government now, so they are the most important party. But the Conservatives also, Penny Mordaunt, many others in the Conservative Party.
Gillian Keegan, the former Education Secretary.
What I really don't understand,
No,
Camilla,
neither do I.
help me.
I don't.
Penny Mordaunt said, a trans woman is a woman,
Yeah.
a trans man is a man, and that's where the debate ends.
But you've got both kind of, I think, a culture of fear. I was thinking earlier, is it just cowardice that in the same way that people started taking the knee without thinking what the implications were and thinking about the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement actually involved claims of defunding the police, this kind of like, we must instantly react to the zeitgeist. I think that did capture a lot of politicians, a lot of well-meaning politicians who were trying to do the right thing by all of their constituents. But the other reason why people didn't stand up against this, and like me and the others we've spoken to on this podcast, were lone voices saying, no, hang on a minute, no, men are men and women are women, even though we got castigated for it, was because there was a climate of fear. Let's also not let history wash over. The scenes that unfolded when the Professor Kathleen Stock, who was gender critical for her sins, she was hounded out of the University of Sussex by campaigners in balaclavas. Okay, this was vicious. That closed down debate, and it made a lot of politicians, and I'm ashamed of them really. They should have stood up. Look at Graham Linehan, the Father Ted creator. His whole career and his life was ruined by his gender-critical views.
He was here today, yeah.
He was cancelled. The whole showbiz fraternity, the comedy fraternity that he was a central part of, completely turned their backs on this man.
Yeah, remind ourselves that David Tennant told Kemi Bade not to shut up and go away.
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't an easy environment for people to stand up. I was able to stand up because I had the Telegraph and the Sunday Express before that behind me saying you have the right to say what you believe. And people like Julie Bindel, who we're going to hear from in just a moment, just have spent their careers saying, no, I'm not going to be told what to think and what to say. We deserve a voice in this. And, thank God they did keep on speaking, really. Thank God they weren't frightened down and, shouted down. By the way, this is the other thing that's easily forgotten. The people in the balaclavas, however they identified, they were men. I know there was a lot of right-on, apparently libertarian women, so-called feminists fighting for the trans cause, clearly very confused in many different ways. But this was, again, an example of the subjugation of women and women's beliefs by men claiming to be women. That's what this was. Right, we're just catching up with the people who have campaigned in this extraordinary case. Julie Bindel, you've been campaigning for decades, to be fair, Julie. How monumental is this? I'm thinking on the way here, is this on a par with votes for women? Am I over-exaggerating? What do you think?
I think it's monumental, not just because it enshrines in law what we already knew and what was a legal fact, but it will also stop the trans activists thinking they can bully women and some men and get their own way and take our rights away from us, as well as having their own perfectly established rights.
What seems to be amazing about it, Julie, and we spoke to Helen Joyce, one of your colleagues and another campaigner, was that she described this as a 10-0 win, that it was absolutely clear that sex matters when it comes to discrimination law. Were you always as positive that you would get such an outcome at the Supreme Court?
I was, and as a feminist law reform campaigner, I'm often on absolute tenterhooks waiting for jury verdicts or court decisions. But I announced last week in Scotland that I would put a limb on a win in this case. Thankfully, I still got all four. And we had to win because the law already establishes it from back in the 1970s. Nothing has changed. Women are still women, adult human females. And Helen Joyce is right, this is a 10-0 win, and it particularly matters. It matters for all women, it actually matters for all human beings, but it matters for lesbians in particular, I think. Lesbians have been forced to challenge men who identify as lesbians invading our spaces, and when we complained, get the landlord or the venue owner to ban us from having those events. So lesbians have gone back to the dark ages in a situation that's even worse than it was for me when I came out as a teenager in the late 1970s. So it could not be more important, and I hope it will now stop employers, universities, other institutions from implementing a law of self-identification that was never the law of the land, but it was Stonewall law.
But that's a really good point, isn't it, Julie? Because yes, this diktat has come from on high, it's the Supreme Court. It's now down to organisations and institutions that frankly had a knee-jerk reaction to a degree of trans hysteria, changing their view. We've got Darlington nurses, they're in the middle of a case. We've got the nurse Jennifer Melly, who has been fired because she called a paedophile in her ward he. They insisted that they were a she and all the rest of it. So it's all very well, this case, but we have to have people following and abiding by this judgment, don't we?
I think now that the law has been set out very clearly by the highest court in the land, in other words, it's not appealable, hopefully those employers and public institutions that we are paying for, including the BBC, needs to recognise that this is not something that women can be discriminated against for, that women are adult human females, that trans women are men, and that they still have rights as enshrined in the 2004 Gender Recognition Act. They have protected characteristics in terms of their gender reassignment. But as the Lesbian Project, that I'm co-founder of with Kathleen Stock, as we argued in our submission to the Supreme Court, we don't really care if the man has a gender recognition certificate, if he's arguing that that's enough of a reason for him to be legally in a lesbian space. Lesbians are not attracted to certificates. We are attracted to other women. And this madness ends now.
Julie, are women owed an apology by the political parties who seem to drink this astonishing Kool-Aid about what a woman was and what a man was, and confused a debate of such essential nature about our identity?
No apology on the planet would be enough for what we have had to put up with. We're being vilified, called Nazis, bigots, being likened to sexual racists by the former chief exec of Stonewall. Cancelled, deplatformed and no platformed, humiliated. I've been physically assaulted, as have other women. And when we have politicians such as David Lammy suggesting on air that some men who identify as trans women can grow a cervix by taking hormones, this has to end now. And it's high time that Keir Starmer gets off his so-called neutral position about this and starts to recognise what women have been through to simply establish the fact that we are women.
Julie Bindel, thank you as ever for appearing on The Daily Tea. I'd like to have a hug at this moment because I think it is a big day. Well done.
That was a lovely moment to see the two of you hug and really summed up the day.
Can I just say one point on that?
Yeah.
What's funny is that this issue has united left and right. I mean, Julie's a lefty, I'm a righty. Got some response from trans campaigners for Labour in my inbox today saying that this was a victory for the far right. What are you talking about? This is a victory for people that believe in equality for women. You know, Julie Bindel is never and will never be far right. But it did unite people across the ideological divide who believe in freedom and believe in equality.
Yeah, it was a really lovely moment. We walked, that was just around the corner. We walked back to the Supreme Court where we caught up with Emma Hartley, who is a 25-year-old who has been hugely affected by this issue. Emma Hartley, we're outside the Supreme Court now. We met just afterwards and you were in floods of tears. This is a really emotional moment, isn't it?
Yeah, a really emotional day. I feel like it's a really vindicating moment for so many of us who have been campaigning in this really like grassroots movement, to finally be told what we know is true all along. As I sort of said to you earlier, it's like the adults are finally back in the room. Yeah, it's such a relief, and it's just so nice that it's finally, it's what we knew to be true has happened, and that actually we can now live our lives and campaign for women's rights, which is what we wanted to do to begin with.
Can you tell us a little bit about the effects of what has happened in the whole debate about what is identity has had on you?
So for me, it's been a really personal journey. So I started in the Lib Dem office and I lost my job. I was sacked because of this debate. I'd asked them about their women's rights lines, and that led to me being let go after 3 days. So I can't really talk about that much, although I crowdfunded at the time, so under Amelia Sparrow. It came down to the fact that I said that Joanna Cherry is not a transphobe in the office, and I think this judgment today shows that Joanna Cherry is not a transphobe, that she cares about women's rights, and that's actually what I said. I said in the office that I really like her stance on human rights, and basically it came down to the fact that somebody else said she's a transphobe and I disagreed, and that put a black mark on my back. And that was a pretty awful experience, but it actually led to possibly the best thing that's ever happened, because where I was quite afraid of talking about this stuff, I was only 24 at the time, I'm 25 now, Joanna ended up offering me a job, so I worked for Joanna for 2 months. And then I worked for Neil Hanvey, so I was doing a Masters in Public Policy at the time, and now I work for Rosie Duffield, so I can, really do this in my work.
Can we talk about the generational divide here? Because I think it is really interesting to speak to somebody of your age, Emma. Your views are not particularly popular among the so-called Zoomers. How's that been, and what do you think this ruling might mean for women of your generation?
Well, I hope it means that it gives us women who agree the confidence to speak out about it, because I think it's the threat of social ostracisation that's been the most powerful and actually the most terrifying. I mean, partly, me getting sacked in the way that I was a moment of, okay, I'm just going to come out now and speak about this, because I knew it was bad, but I didn't know it was that bad. And actually, I've lost friends. There are people who, even just talking now, who won't know, who'll have seen. I've seen some pictures from this morning, and they'll be like, "Oh, you're involved in this." But I think that's what we've got to do now, is broaden that conversation and go, you can talk about this, and we can disagree, and that's okay. But we should be able to talk about it, because I think that's part of the problem, is there's been such a chilling effect and there's so much fear. And women, well, men as well, but mainly women have lost jobs, they've lost friends, they have family members that won't speak to them. The personal cost has been insane. And I think that's why today is so important, because it sort of tells everybody what they knew already, but it also highlights the madness that people haven't been speaking up about it.
But on that vein, it's got to filter down now into schools and universities. At the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything if you've still got organisations that teach our children, both male and female, something different to what has been decreed in the Supreme Court behind us.
Yes, and they have to realise that this whole progressive sort of activism is not progressive, it's profoundly regressive. It's embedding stereotypes about what women should be into life and at school, and you're saying, okay, so you don't conform here, that means you must be born in the wrong body. Well, you can't be born in the wrong body. That's such a regressive idea that's gone so deep, and unfortunately it's your it's the kids that are the most vulnerable, that have suffered the most from this, and people that speak out about it get pulled down really publicly. I mean, we should pay tribute to Joanna Cherry, to Rosie Duffield, to Miriam Cates, to the people that have stood up against it. And I mean, still the Greens, the Lib Dems, they're all in such a mess over this, and I hope this will empower Labour MPs that do secretly will tell you behind closed doors, but say, oh, can't talk about this publicly, to say, yeah, this is a completely okay thing to think, that men are men and women are women, and yes, that trans women are trans women, and that's fine, they have specific needs and rights as well, but we need to be able to define a category of people to make good policy, so everybody benefits from this ruling. And I really hope that people pick up from that, because that's just better for public policy in general, and that's how the unanimous judgment is so powerful. I mean, the law's been a mess, and I just hope that, I hope so many more will come together and we can actually start to make progress on issues that really matter.
The law had been an ass, now it's a thoroughbred.
Emma Harley, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea.
Thank you so much.
Look, I think from all of the people we've interviewed, Kamal, this isn't over. We've got this judgment, but let's now see how the government reacts, how our institutions and organisations react. I think this is a campaign that still has some way to go.